Welcome to another presentation from the House of David Fellowship in Richmond, Virginia. I am Lee Miller. Today we are continuing our study in Acts chapter 21. We did part 1 and part 2, which we reviewed in our last meeting. We are now in part 3. We started 3, that's why it says 3.1. In this particular one, you'll notice that it says 3.2. It's just Acts 21, part 3.2. This will be done in 3 parts. All right, the title of this presentation is, What is it? Now, that was my early title. I liked it. Then I changed it to vocabulary, and that's what I sent out to everybody in the assembly, that this was going to be about vocabulary, because it's about vocabulary. But then when I was working through it, I was trying to finish it up this week, it was like, no, I'm going to go back to the original title, what is it? Because we have to answer the question, what it is. So here we go. On tap. We're going to deal with, what is it? You'll get that answer at the end. We're going to review 3.1. We addressed fulfill from Matthew 5:17. I will review it just a short time. We're also going to do jot and tittle, which is verse 18 of Matthew 5. And you can't, come on. Jot and tittle, you got to mention heaven and earth. So we'll talk about those together in the review. And then finally, the end of 3.1's presentation was about measuring the pattern. Pattern being the word that is found in Exodus chapter 25, verse 9 and verse 40, but we referenced the pattern from the millennial temple in Ezekiel, and that's where the passage was quoted from. So we will tie these things up in 3.3, but today we have to find out what is it. So here we go. Getting the whole picture is what we'll do, and it's about vocabulary, so let's get started. In review, there was a question about Yeshua coming to fulfill. Matthew 5:17 reads as such. The problem is that fulfill, depending on whether the voice of the verb is active or passive, determines the definition of the verb. This is the case through the Old Testament in Greek and the New Testament, where the word occurs a number of times. So we went through that and identified where, when a passage is passive, what does that look like? And I quoted an example from the Greek New Testament. And then we looked at the passage in 5:17 and the Greek there to demonstrate what was being discussed within first century Judaism. That was covered in 3.1, and I addressed fulfill, so that is now a satisfied point. All right, in addition to that, we needed to go into verse 18, because 18 says, not a jot or tittle will be done away from the instructions, the Torah, until heaven and earth pass away. Now, some of your translations may contain some phrase like, until all things are fulfilled. Well, here's the problem. The word fulfill is not in the text. Might be in your English, but it's not in the text. So we're going to address it from the standpoint of what the text actually says, which is, not a jot or a tittle are going to change until heaven and earth pass away. Then, when we were going through this last time, I took you to Revelation 21, verse 1 and verse 22, in which it showed that the new heavens and the new earth, then it says, continuation verse 1, they've passed away. Then when you get down to 22, guess what it says? There's no temple. And that is the subject of what we're discussing. So you can see when we get to the 8th day, temple as you understand it does not exist. It defines what the new temple is. We covered that last week. So I thought it was interesting how in Yeshua's use of heaven and earth, jot and tittle, whether it's a figure of speech or a literal, they're both true. So I was like, okay, this is good. So that's where we were. We have now satisfied the question about Christ came to fulfill it, so what are we doing? That has been answered. Now, the last thing I want to address is the measure the pattern. Now, we did measure the pattern because when I think it's an angel who is talking to either Ezekiel or some other individual, I thought it was Ezekiel, and was explaining the millennial temple in great detail. And when I say great detail, I am talking about great detail. And in the text there, it's talking about the Gentiles who attach themselves to Israel, saying that they need to take account of their sinful actions and measure the pattern. And so we went over that in 3.1, and so that has been addressed. So when you look at 3.1, then you'll go, oh, okay, this is what he was talking about. So that is our review of the three main points that were covered in 3.1. So let's get started with our vocabulary lesson. We have at least 5, maybe more, but I'm pretty sure it's 5. We have 5 words that you need to know what they mean. Now, some of these words you're familiar with. So that's going to be easy for you. You're just going to flow straight through it. A couple of these other words, it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? How is that used? And I'm going to give you an example. There's not a single vocabulary word that I give you that there's not an example of, unless I'm hiding something from you, which is always possible. All right, so anyway, the first word in English, I call the main point. All right, and I'm going to show you where this word occurs in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. It says, this is my summary of the text. Daniel has dreams and visions about the 4 world kingdoms replaced by the kingdom of God. We're familiar with that. There was a lot of detail there. Let's look at the verse. In verse 1, it says, in the first year, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. The Greek word that I'm addressing is the word translated summary in this text. So what has taken place here, he has seen visions. He's got this crazy stuff out there, which if you've read it, chapter 7, you know there's some crazy stuff there. He's got that happening, and he has received everything, and so he starts you off by saying, let me present the summary, the main point of what I saw. And so we're going to use this. This word's going to show up again, and it's going to be part of how we close this presentation. So that's why I'm bringing this out. This is an example of main point. Now, one of the things that you might be familiar with is the word gar, which is G-A-R in the Greek, and it shows up in Acts 15:21, which we have discussed on numerous occasions. And in this particular case, dealing with James and his discussion about what happens with those who are gers, going back to Leviticus 17 and 18, the 4 points there, which are found in 17 and 18, he says those 4 points, and then he starts out, Acts 15:21, the first word is Moses, but the next word of importance is G-A-R. And so that word is generally translated as therefore. Sometimes it's translated as because. So in this particular case, you might look at it, James gives these 4 things. Well, why does James give these 4 things? Because, and then he gives the answer. I'm going to show you the slide. I have made it up. Here we go. I have quoted Thayer's as a Greek lexicon so that you can understand how they understand G-A-R. They say the reason and cause of a foregoing statement is added. So something was said, and the reason and cause is now coming. All right, so you're going to get that. Some previous declaration is explained properly of affirmation and conclusion, denoting truly therefore, verily as the case stands. That's a different way that it would be translated. So now, let me give you Acts 15, 20, and 21 in my translation so you can see the effect of the Greek word G-A-R on the context. They should abstain from these 4 because the law of Moses has been taught in every city from earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So this is an example of where G-A-R gives you that. But that's not the word that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with G-A-R. We're talking about something that is more specifically a main point that is going to be presented. Not something that's going to be summed up. So I didn't want you to confuse the word in Daniel with the word in Acts. Let me give you a couple more definitions. LEH is the Septuagint lexicon, and it's real simple. Summary, main point. Freiberg, in the progression of an argument, the main or principal point. Louw-Nida, a brief statement of the main point. Little and Scott, the chief or main point. Anybody see a pattern here? I shouldn't say that because pattern is one of our words. But anyway, anybody see a pattern here? Thayer, the chief or main point, the principal thing. And Bedag, the main point in what has been said. I also quoted a translation author. His name is Weist, I believe is how it's pronounced. And this is how he translates that word in use. He says, now, in the consideration of the things which are being spoken, this is the chief point. All right, so you feel what I'm going for here. I think, out of all these definitions, I like Weist best. I think he does a great job with this one. All right, so there you go. Second word, pattern. We also have Hebrew, so let me take it to 25:40 of Exodus, where we were last meeting. See that you make them according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Here's the Hebrew. First, of course, I have it in the Greek because we're dealing with other Greek words, but this is the Hebrew pattern according to which anything is to be constructed, and it refers to of the tabernacle because in Exodus 25:9 and verse 40, it talks about that. And the temple in 1 Chronicles 28, which we read all those verses last time so that you could see exactly how the word pattern repeats itself when it relates to the tabernacle, which is our discussion. Tabernacle, priesthood, sacrificial system, all those pieces together, which I might call the tabernacle or the tabernacle system, it is referred specifically in 1 Chronicles 28 several times, which we went over all of those verses in the last meeting. All right, let's go to our Greek definitions. Teton is the word at the top there, T-U-P-O-N, as a small-scale form designed to be copied. Small-scale form designed to be copied as a pattern, model, that's Freiberg's, okay. Thayer, an example. In the technical sense, the pattern in conformity to which a thing must be made. So here, we're making something like this. LEH, that's the Septuagint, lexicon, same thing, pattern and model. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the sense of the original in contrast to the copy. In the Mosaic discussion in Exodus, it's make sure you make it according to the pattern, the original that you saw on the mountaintop. So we're making something of a copy of something. We'll get more into that. I have another word that's going to explain that in more detail. All right, so that's my second word, pattern. Third word is example. There's the Greek word for that. I'm going to show you a text. You've seen this word before. This is a general word. We use this word in our regular life. It's that simple. Here's an example. Yeshua says, he washes the feet of the disciples as an act of humble service to them, intimating that the disciples are to serve one another in humility instead of seeking preeminence over one another. We saw how that worked out. Here's the verse. He says, I have given you an example. You should do just as I have done for you. So that's the Greek word that we're dealing with. Let me give you another example. This is really getting bad. Okay, another example of example. This is in 2 Peter 2:6. And if he turned to ashes the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, when he condemned them to destruction, having appointed them to serve as an example to future generations of the ungodly. This is another example of example. And my third example of example, James 5:10. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers and sisters, take the prophets, because the prophets suffered a lot. So there's an example. So there you go. There is several examples of example. Now let's go to the lexicons. We have to have support. Freiberg, in a positive sense, as something to be imitated, possibly an example. 3, as a representative copy or a likeness of what is original and genuine. Okay, see where this is going? Let's go to Thayer, representation, figure, and example for imitation. Boy, this word example shows up a lot. This LEH, which is the Septuagint, lexicon, pattern, plan of a house, example. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, it means an example. may also mean image or copy. We use this word all the time. This is what we do. All right, next word up. This is word number 4, shadow. You know this word. We talked about it in the Torah portion today. S-K-I-A is our Greek word. You saw it in Colossians, so let me break the Colossians 2:16 to 17 passage down so that we can see exactly how it fits, because this is going to be one of our keys. I am going to build this text as we unfold it. So here we go. Therefore, let no one judge except the body of believers. That's the essence of what Paul said. Now let's start plugging stuff in. This is like a casserole that the only thing in it right now is tater tots. And it's time to add the eggs and the garlic. I'm sure something else could go in there too. But anyway, this is what we're doing. We're going to add to the text. So here we go. What are you judging? Therefore, let no one judge means something's being judged. Well, eating and drinking. That's what the text says. Do not let anyone judge your eating and drinking. But when? I eat and drink all the time. When is it talking about? At a festival, a new moon, or Sabbath? That's when it's talking about. Well, now I have a follow-up question. What are the festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths? We know them as Moed, some of them are hogs, we got some other words. But what does this text call them? It calls them a shadow of things to come. So, let's look at the whole verse. Therefore, let no one judge your eating and drinking at a festival, a new moon, or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, except the body of believers. So for us, shadow, you see what it's saying about the festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths are a shadow. I mean, we observe the festivals, we observe the Sabbaths, we observe the new moon in the 7th month. They are a shadow of things to come. So it's talking about a subject. Let's go to our lexicons. Freiberg, prophetically of the relation of type to antitype. I didn't really like that definition, but I use Freiberg, so I do that. Foreshadowing. He actually would translate the text, new festival, new moon, or Sabbath, which foreshadow things to come. That's how he would translate it, which I can go there. Wiest is up next. Imperfect portrayal or representation of a thing, of a reality which it does not embody. That is a great definition. When was the last time you saw a shadow that was actually the reality? The answer is never. It never embodies the reality. All right, continuing. He says, a shadow has no substance in itself, which is true. It has no independent existence. It merely is proof of the fact that there is a reality back of it. It is not itself solid or real. That's what a shadow. Bedag, the shape cast by an object as it blocks rays of light. That's a little more technical definition, but if you could imagine a flagpole, and the flagpole's in front of this building, and you're on the side of the building, and the sun's coming down, and it hits the flagpole, what's going to cast over here? A shadow, because it blocks the ray of light coming down and shows us something. That's an example. Continuing with him, number 3, the idea of a contrast between image and reality, a shadow of what is to come, which is the passage that we just quoted. So the question is, I'm going to show you something, and I want you to tell me, what are you going to see? Here we go. Here's what it is. It is the blueprint of a flagpole. See at the bottom it says flagpole detail. If I take this blueprint and I go in front of that building and I set it there and the sun strikes this blueprint, am I going to see a flagpole or am I going to see the shadow of the blueprint? It's not a blueprint. That if I have something that is a blueprint, I'm going to see the piece of paper. I'm not going to see what is on the blueprint. I'm going to see the piece of paper. If the flagpole is there, the sun strikes it, I'm going to see that reality object. But putting the blueprint in front of there is not going to show me the flagpole. It's going to show me the reality of the object that's blocking the sun rays. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's continue with our definitions. Thayer, a shade caused by the interception of the light. Once again, a little technical. An image cast by an object and representing the form of that object, the express likeness. Thought that was pretty good. TDNT denotes the unreality of an object. That was a strong opening statement. They also add, it should not be overlooked that a shadow points to a reality, but is not itself the reality. So, let me ask you this question. If I go to you, we got the flagpole, it's in front of the building, I'm talking to my friend here, we're walking along the side of the building, sun's shining down, I see the shadow, and he says, can you get rid of that shadow? Not without getting rid of the flagpole. To get rid of a shadow, you have to get rid of the reality. You can't just walk up to the shadow, get a shovel, dig up some ground. You know what's going to happen? Shadow's going to be a little lower, but it's still going to be there. You can't get rid of a shadow unless you get rid of the reality. I thought that was pretty good. All right, our last word. How many people are familiar with this word? Parable. Well, hopefully I'll tell you something you don't know about it. That is the Greek word. It's spelled almost the same way in Greek as it is in English. It's P-A-R-A, except they add the letter O. So instead of B-L-E, it's B-O-L-E. So it's pretty close, but that's how they spell it. That's how you'll find it in the Greek, Old Testament, New Testament. So I am going to give you some examples here so you can see it in use. Certainly you are familiar with these. The same day went Yeshua out of the house, and he sat by the sea. Great multitudes were gathered together unto him, so that he went into a ship, sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore, and he spake many things unto them in parables. He was not the first person to use parables. Well-established practice. Other messiahs, other leaders in Israel who taught used parables. They date back centuries. This is not a new thing. Okay? It's just a efficient way to do things. And this, just as an example, this is chapter 13 of Matthew. The word parable shows up 12 times in that one chapter. That's a lot, generally speaking. And if you were to go through, I don't know, I have 100x there. I don't know if that's the whole scriptures or just the New Testament. I don't remember what my search was, but it shows up a lot of times. But see, you are familiar with that, so I'm going to try to bring out some other things that you need to consider when you see that word. So let's take a look. We have the parable of the sower. That's in verse 3. How many people have heard of that one? Then there's the parable of the kingdom of heaven. Do you know that there are 6 parables that he gives in that chapter on the kingdom of heaven? And I find it helpful because here's what he does. He'll go, here's a parable on what the kingdom of heaven is like. So I know exactly what he's talking about. It's right there. And the seed and the sower, that was a little more complex. And so then the disciples came and they said, can you explain it? And so then he explains it. And I got a verse that talks about that too. And there were some other things where he told a parable, and that would be Mark 7 and Matthew 15. And in those two, he gave the story. Nobody got it. He gave it again differently. Nobody got it. And then the disciples came and said, man, can you explain this to us? Because we ain't getting it. And so he explains it. So sometimes the parable's hard to understand, but that's what happened in those two passages. All right, so let's take a look at the question that is on everyone's mind. What is a parable? All right, definitions. It's a short story to help one understand something else better. And I use short in quotes because sometimes it's not so short. It's short. Generally, it's short. Some of them are very short. Some of them are not so short. So it's kind of a short story. And I tell you, Yeshua's got some short ones. All right, another definition. A narrative or saying, and this was of varying length. I escaped the short there. Designed to illustrate a truth, especially through comparison. Now that word is going to be important to us. So you're comparing one thing with another. You know, I should have looked up analogy. I bet analogy might be close to parable. I don't know, but it might be because we use analogies a lot in life. Now, let me break some things down for you. The story could be true. The story that you're being told in this parable, it could be true and ongoing. And I'm going to share one of those later with you, but not immediately. Then the story could be kind of true in the sense that it's just occurred in the recent past. I'm going to give you an example of that. How many are familiar with 2 Samuel 12, David and Nathan? This is where Nathan came to David and he said, I want to tell you a story about a man with a lamb. And so he goes through the story. And what is he talking about? An event had just taken place. And so the prophet presented this story to make a comparison to what had happened. The injustice arose within the king to where he wanted to address it, and the parable was successful. And Nathan turns to him and says, you're the man. So there's an example of a short story doing a comparison. We do this. We use short stories to make comparisons. The story could be true without God's intervention. I wanted to bring this up because sometimes a short story can't be true at all. And some people are concerned about parables in which the story can't be true. Well, I've got some examples here, so we'll get to that. But there are stories that could be true without God's intervention. So here's a couple of examples. Workers in the vineyard. It is possible that a man could have owned a vineyard, and in the morning he could have hired some people to help work. And then in the afternoon, some guys came and said, I'd like to work on this. And he said, hey, come on, I'll pay you. So it is possible that the workers in the vineyard parable could have been a true story. It didn't require God to be involved. Okay, so there's an example. Now, how about the wicked husbandman? This is another vineyard story. It is possible that a man could have owned a vineyard. He could have hired some people to manage it. He could have left town. They didn't do a very good job. Eventually, he sends his son to get things straightened out. They kill his son. That could have happened. It's possible. It didn't require God to be involved, but it could have happened. So that's reasonable. Now, there are some stories that cannot be true unless God has a direct intervention. We just read one of them recently. How many donkeys have you conversed with? I have a limited number of donkeys that I have conversed with. Okay? In this particular case, some events took place in Balaam's life, and then it says, and God opened the donkey's mouth, and he conversed with Balaam. And I'm still amazed that Balaam was like, what's happening here? No, he was just like, oh, what did you say? Yeah, okay. So anyway, in that particular case, I'm not saying that's a parable, I'm just giving you an example. In that particular case, that story could not be true unless God directly intervened. Because donkeys are not generally designed to talk to humans. All right? All right, let me give you another story. This is from Judges 9. Abimelech is the son of Gideon's father. No, Gideon. Abimelech is the son of Gideon. And let me give you some background on this. In this particular situation, Judges opens up after the death of Joshua. We have the story of Deborah, and there's a couple other people in the stories. And what was happening was it was a yo-yo effect. They would obey God. That particular judge would die. They would not obey God. He'd raise another judge. And at one point, Gideon was raised. And we know some of the stories about Gideon. He had the fleece thing that he wanted to try. He also had... there was a couple other things that he wanted to do. It all worked out. Oh, I remember that he also wanted to have an army to attack the Midianites, but it was too big, so God said we need to pare this down. Ended up with 300. So those are some stories of Gideon. So that's probably around chapter 7. So Gideon goes through, he deals with the Midianites, all solved. So he has 70 sons. And for you ladies who are wondering if he had more than one wife, you are correct. The text does say that he had more than one wife to produce the 70 sons. All right? I just want to make sure that was covered. I didn't want anybody to be distracted by that. In addition, besides the multiple wives, of which we have no number, he also had a concubine. Okay? And he had the 70 sons, and then he had another child from the concubine whose name was Abimelech. And I put Jotham there because I wanted you to know the name of the son, the youngest son of Gideon. Of the 70, he's the youngest son. So what happens here is that Abimelech goes to a group of people and says, you know what? Do you want me to rule over you? Or do you want to have all the sons of Gideon to rule over you? And the people talk about it and they say, you know, I think we'll have you rule over us. So they give him some money and he goes and murders all of the sons of his father. All 70. Except the youngest one escapes. So the youngest one finds out about this, and the younger one gives a proverb. And in that proverb, this is what he raises. And this is a special type of proverb parable because it's also not only historical, but it has a future prophetic sense to it. So here's what the parable was. All the trees in the forest got together and they went to the olive tree and they said, hey, you want to be king over us? And the olive tree said no. So the other tree said, okay, well, we're going to go to the vine tree. Would you like to be king over us? No, I'm good. So then he goes to the vine. All these trees go to the vine, say, hey, you want to be king over us? Nope, I'm good. Finally, the trees go to the thorn bushes, which in your text might be called the bramble. And the bramble says, okay, look, you want me to be king over you. We can do that. But you have to come over here and do this. And if you don't, the fire is going to consume all of you. That's the story that's being told by the youngest son who survived this massacre. So what happens? When it's over, 3 years, God sends an evil spirit between Abimelech and those people that he's king over, and both of them consume each other in fire. And now they're all dead. And that's how the story ends. So here we have a story about trees, cedar trees, olive trees, fig trees, vines, and thorn bushes all having a discussion. Probably not true. Generally speaking, bushes do not talk. Some burn without being consumed, but that's an exception. So once again, it is not of paramount importance whether or not the story is true. We don't want to be distracted by that. Okay? So another example of a parable is Proverbs 20 and verse 2. It can be very short. It is, a king's wrath strikes terror like the roar of a lion. Remember definition? Explaining something by a comparison. Maybe you've never seen the king, but you saw a lion. If a lion is sitting where that camera was and roared at me, that'd be a little bit terrifying. Okay? So that would be like the king's wrath. And the text goes on, but I'm just saying, this is a very short story. All right, let's go to our lexicons. Freiberg, setting one thing beside another for a comparison. Lohenider, relatively short narrative with symbolic meaning. The equivalent in some languages may be a likeness story. Let me tell you a story about something that's like this. A story that teaches. We all use that. Little and Scott, comparison. Illustration, Wuest, that which is thrown alongside of something else to explain it. Thrown alongside is actually the technical definition of the word used in classical Greek, to cast aside, to explain something by casting something else aside. Thought that was good. An object lesson to explain spiritual truth. Thayer, placing of one thing by the side of another. Metaphorically speaking, a comparison of one thing with another. Notice that everybody is in agreement. All of the major lexicons in agreement. A narrative, fictitious but agreeable to the laws and usages of human life. That's in there. I put this in because if you go back and look at the parables that we have in the scriptures, you will see that many of them build on things that relate to regular life. A person with a vineyard, a person sowing seed, and a dozen other things that the people would have understood to try to learn a concept. So that's why this is in here. A narrative, fictitious but agreeable to the laws and usages of human life, by which either the duties of men or the things of God, particularly the nature and history of God's kingdom, are figuratively portrayed. I thought that was a pretty good definition. BDAG, something that serves as a model or example pointing beyond itself, pointing beyond itself. The narrative of a parable, the short story, the something that's cast alongside, is never the thing. It's always pointing beyond itself. A narrative of saying of varying length, you already saw this, designed to illustrate truth, especially through comparison. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament had setting beside. The parables were designed to make concepts easier to understand by means of concrete illustrations from familiar fields. That's what was done in the first century. Just something to help you understand something else that you can't understand. Listen, I don't know a lot about the kingdom of heaven. I can't go up there and knock on the door and find out about the kingdom of heaven. But if somebody can say the kingdom of heaven is like these three ladies that were walking down the street, well, now I'm with you. Well, okay, tell me more. You see what I'm saying? The understanding of parables presupposes listeners who are willing to accompany the speaker in his thinking and who are capable of grasping the similarity between image and reality. Now we're getting into this aspect which is not a major point for us, but I put it in because I just want you to be familiar with this concept. So we'll go through it quickly. Why were parables used? You've probably read this before. Yeshua explains in Matthew 13, which the first parable is the sower of the seed. I had shown that. Here's what he says. After he says it, he says, "Who hath ears to hear, let him hear." He didn't invent that phrase. That phrase had been used decades before. The idea being, I'm going to tell you a story. Some people are going to hear it, and some people are going to hear it. And that's the difference here. I've got a few more verses to explain this. Let's go to verse 10. The disciples came and said unto him, "Why do you speak unto everybody in parables?" 11. He answered and said unto them, "Because it is given for you to know the mysteries of the kingdom, but it's not given to them." I've often wondered about that passage. Of course, we're going to read Isaiah 6 in a moment, so that will explain it. But I'm just saying, there was a time when I wondered about that because I'm thinking, don't you want to just lay this whole thing out for everybody? And I found out the answer is no. All right, let's keep going. Verse 13. "For this reason I speak to them in parables. Although they see what I'm talking about, they don't really see what it's pointing to. And although they hear the words that I'm saying, they don't hear what it's pointing to. And therefore, they don't understand. Because they're not engaged to want to know the spiritual things of God." Keep going. Here we go. "And in them is fulfilled," I put fulfilled in yellow because it's in the passive voice. "And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which said, By hearing you shall hear and shall not understand, seeing you shall see and shall not perceive." 15. "And for this people's heart has become calloused, they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." Now, this is the Isaiah prophecy, but here's the thing. The style of prophecy is called sarcasm. So I'm going to retranslate this using the sarcastic principle, which I'm really good at. Right, Dan? Okay, I'll get there. Parables both conceal or reveal depending on whether you're open to hearing what they're teaching. If you're not interested, if you are disconnected, you're not going to hear what I'm talking about. You're just going to hear a story. You're going to dismiss it. You're going to move on. But if you are interested, the kingdom of heaven, tell me more. Now we got something going on. Here's Isaiah 6. It's called Irony and Sarcasm. He said, "Go and tell these people, you continually hear, but you don't understand. You continually see, but don't perceive." This is my translation. "For the heart of this people has become insensitive. Make their ears deaf and their eyes blind. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their mind, repent and be restored." And they certainly wouldn't want that, would they? That's what it's really saying. Because when you read the contextual work around that passage, it had passed. The time of repentance had passed. Judgment was coming, and there was no more discussion. And so do not make this clear to them, because what happens if they decide they want to repent? God has said it's too late to repent. Punishment's coming. Then we'll talk about repentance, which is discussed later. So I just wanted you to see that within a parable, it's a story cast alongside to illustrate a truth you can't get any other way, but you better be engaged and ready to listen. Otherwise, it's going to go. And that's not a good thing. Because then you're the Isaiah 6 people. So we have to be on guard. That's why there are so many scriptures, like in the New Testament, where we are actively engaged with each other. So I come and say, okay, look, I think I'm plowing the field here and I'm doing a pretty good job. But if you see something that I'm missing, I need to hear it. I get feedback from my wife, but that's the only one I get feedback from. I need to hear it from others who see me in different situations so I can go, I'm going to have to consider that. Because I do not want to arrive at a place where it's all going over here, it's coming in here and going right out there. I don't want to be there. So I look to the assembly to keep me on the narrow path. All right, anyway, enough soapbox. One benefit of the parables is that the truth is revealed to those who desire it, and at the exact same time, that same truth is concealed from those who don't care. How cool is that? That's pretty cool. All right, let's review our words. We've got the main point, a summary of what's just been presented. Pattern. How many people can say it? Make it according to the pattern. Example, something to be imitated. Shadow has no substance, but the shape is cast by the actual object. And parable, a narrative or saying of varying length, designed to illustrate a truth, especially through comparison. Also an object lesson used to explain spiritual truth. That's the one that we're going to be focused on. And a narrative or saying of varying length, designed to illustrate a truth, especially through comparison. I put that again, because that is such a great definition. I had to put it twice on one slide, because I really want you to think about that. Now, we are going to go to the book of Hebrews, and we're going to look at something. I happen to be personally impressed with the person who wrote Hebrews. It could be Paul. He certainly had the skill to do it. If it's not, I'd like to know who it was. But there are some people who feel that Paul did not write this based on chapter 2, verse 3. I'm not persuaded on that. But I'm just going to say the author of Hebrews, because I've gone through and broke down some of the stuff. One of the things I'm really impressed with, the author was an expert in using the 7 rules of Hillel and other complex forms of scriptural discussion that were used in the first century. He breaks down different arguments using those rules, and so he's got some stuff. Plus, not only that, but he understands the sacrificial system and the priesthood better than anybody I've ever read. But anyway, like I said, I don't know who it is, but whoever it is, the one thing that I do know is this man knows how to make an argument, or it could be a lady. Some people think it's Priscilla. And especially the 7 rules of Hillel, which I want to comment on. That gentleman lived from 60 BC to 20 CE. And he had a school. Many of you probably know that, the school of Hillel. When he died, he passed his school on to his son. Then when he died, he passed the school on to his son. And his son was Gamaliel, who Paul was a student of. So, it could very well be that Paul wrote this letter, but I don't know. All right, but it doesn't matter. I'm impressed with what the man wrote. So here we go. I'm going to quote beginning in chapter 8, verse 1. Now, the main point of what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. This one had to do that too. But if he was on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, because we already got that laid out by the law. But these guys serve at a sanctuary, which is the example, and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished by God. This is chapter 25 of Exodus 9 and 40. Make it according to the pattern. So right here, we have all but one of the words that we define talking about the entire priesthood sanctuary operation. All of those words that I just told you are talking about it right here, but we haven't finished. Here's the summary of that text. High priest who sits at the right hand of the throne of the Most High, minister of the true tabernacle pitched by God. Meanwhile, there are those who serve on the tabernacle of earth, which is an example and shadow of the heavenly things, following the instructions to Moses to make it according to the pattern. Then in verse 9, the author of Hebrews writes, the tabernacle is a parable. That's the Greek word there. The entire understanding of the tabernacle, the gifts, the sacrifices, the priesthoods, the clothes, the furniture, the entire thing is a story that is laid next to something else. That's why the word parable was used there. The tabernacle is a parable for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. And he talks about this more in 10, which we'll discuss in the next part. Note, the tabernacle includes the priesthood and sacrificial system in all references. That's how I am referring to it, to shorten it. In other words, the tabernacle, when standing and operating, told a story which illustrated a point, a truth, pointing beyond itself. That's what that word means. As a shadow, it reflected the true heavenly priesthood and the true heavenly tabernacle made by God. It was made according to the pattern and was an example, something to be imitated. Then in chapter 10, verse 1, he says, for the Torah, for is our G-A-R word, that's why I went over it in Acts 15:21, the Torah, although it has a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of those things. You know what shadow was? It's only a form, an unreality of the reality it's pointing to. Can never by the same sacrifices, which are offered continually year after year, make perfect those who draw near. And I put Yom Kippur in parentheses at the top of verse 1, because this is where he uses the Greek word G-A-R, which is a summary of the previous chapter, where he discusses Yom Kippur. That's what he's summarizing what happens in the once-a-year festival, and is saying that it's a shadow of something to come, but it is not the reality. And by the way, this was a big deal, both for what became Rabbinic Judaism, as well as the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, where when the temple was destroyed and sacrifices could not continue, everybody was very concerned about what they're going to do. I have those writings and I've read them, a little outside the scope for us. But this was something that was serious, and yet the writer in Hebrews is addressing the shadow aspect. Everything was pointing to something else that was already in heaven that Moses saw on the mountain. That's exactly what the text says in Exodus. So we've discussed form, we've discussed shadow. I wanted to put up here form. This was a word that was in that particular text, a visible manifestation of an invisible reality. Because right now, when you look up into heaven, you do not see the active tabernacle, the active priesthood. You do not see it. But the form that was used by the author of Hebrews, that word put into Hebrews 10, he was saying that what you're seeing in the priesthood is a manifestation of the invisible reality. I've put that into the text so you can see it fit. The Torah, although it has a visible manifestation of an invisible and heavenly reality, is not itself the actual form of the reality. That's what all of this has been saying. Whether you use example, whether you use pattern, whether you use shadow, whether you use parable, all of them are focusing on the same thing. The entire priesthood system is not a reality. It is a visible manifestation of something that is invisible in the heavenlies. Now, that's a whole new concept for us. And I mentioned about the service here of Yom Kippur because that's how I understand 9. So let's take a look at this from what we've experienced. What else is a shadow? Back to Colossians 2:17, we celebrate Passover. It wasn't that long ago that we celebrated Passover. And what does Paul say? It's a shadow. We seem to have no problem observing that shadow. Isn't that interesting? The Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system is a story designed to illustrate the truth of what happened at the true tabernacle made by God. And some of the passages we're going to deal with next time deal with chronological timeline pieces to see when things took place. Can't do that today because I'm out of time, but that is something that we're going to be addressing. Finally, it does this by being an object lesson using a comparison. So, what was my original question at the beginning of this? What is the priesthood and the sacrificial system? The example is, the answer is the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system serve as a model example pointing beyond itself. It's a shadow, an imperfect portrayal or representation of a thing, of a reality, which it does not embody. Pretty interesting. It has no substance, but the shape is cast by the actual object. That's what we learn from shadow, in this case, the heavenly. So, looking at what is coming in 3.3, now that we know what it is, we can talk about how it fits in with our understanding, because we are looking at the feasts and doing them. We are looking at the new moon and doing it on the 7th month. And we are looking at the Sabbath, which we're doing weekly. And we know that all of them are a shadow. And so the priesthood, which was promised to the line of Levite, which was then quoted in Ezekiel, demonstrating that during that time period, this shadow system, example, copy, image, parable, will continue to be performed for the people who will learn from it. Remember, a lot of people get killed at the end because they do not see it. So we're going to connect that timeline next time. But I just wanted you to be able to understand that we are dealing with, in that system, the same thing that we deal with when we deal with the feasts, the new moon, and the Sabbaths. These things are a picture of something that is coming. All right, so that is the end of this presentation. And I will take questions.